Hello everyone, welcome back to the Shizen Hogo-Ku Zoo here on Planet Zoo in our franchise mode. Welcome back. Today we are removing our old habitat for our giant pandas, and this time we are going to be adding in our red pandas. So we're going to go over a huge transformation of this one area and hopefully give it some more light to the situation toward the front of our park, because right now it's just a dead space. As of right now, we are probably going to keep the river. I don't think we're going to remove it, as in for right now anyhow. That may change along the lines down the road. But just a little bit of background information about these red pandas. They are not related to the giant pandas, and they are actually affected by deforestation and poaching. So when we are going into the video, our first phase is going to be about making the habitat itself, and the second phase is going to be about going in and adding in those informational boards along with other facilities for our people. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Let's get to it. Okay, so we start off things by removing our previous barrier to our last habitat. Now in this process, we ended up removing a bunch of things such as the barrier and the plants and other little toys that the animals use in the area and whatnot like that, including the heaters and other functional items. The only thing that I don't end up removing is the shelter along with our entrance to that main area. Now during this process, we also wanted to delete the path leading up to our new habitat for our pandas because, quite simply, it just looks awful. It's a big eyesore and I wanted to change it. Now down there, you see a little path kind of bump out and it's just a little circle. We end up keeping that there, unfortunately, because, and I say unfortunately because if I were to remove it, the whole entire plaza would basically be deleted. In order to prevent that, we just ended up leaving in that little bit. I tried to recreate it, but the thing is that little pond there next to our restrooms prevented us from rebuilding the path. So therefore we just ended up leaving that little divot in that pathway. I don't really know what to call it, but we're gonna do something with that later. I don't know what we're gonna do with it. Maybe make it into like a little side garden or something like that. But essentially, I'll probably end up doing that off camera or in another video. But as for this hill here, we end up recreating it so it doesn't look as awful as it did prior. We end up building the path on the ground and we end up terraforming the landscape for this to really work out. Now we did this because the bridges, it just wasn't working the way I wanted it to, and we have a lot more freedom with the pathways when they're not in bridge form, or at least in my opinion. So we ended up just bringing up the pathway, and we really tried to make it so there's not a heavy incline at any point in time. Of course, it's not going to be perfect, nor is it ever going to be perfect, so therefore we just let it be after a little while. Otherwise I'm going to drive myself crazy. But moving on to the habitat, I end up using a chain link fence, believe it or not. I mentioned before, at least I believe I mentioned it before, that I don't like chain link fences, but I ended up using it because I thought it was just probably a good way to do it for an animal such as our red pandas. And that is because usually when you have animals that are small and they climb things, it's just typical that there's chained fences for these animals to see through. I don't know what it is, but zoos do this, and just a lot of habitats have this with animals that tend to climb. I don't know what it is, but regardless, I thought it was the right way to go, so that's what we did. In addition, we also added the wood fencing, or I should say the wooden barrier, so we make sure that our animals can't climb into that either, but we used it more as a backdrop, more of a barrier so people can't see through it in areas where we don't want our people looking through. Now we built out this path here because we wanted to make sure that our guests have a nice viewing area, but it's not going to block any of the major pathways to get from one habitat to another. And it's a little bit closer to the front of the park, which I thought was necessary considering that there's not a lot of habitats close to the front of the park. When you go through the front of the park, you want to see another animal somewhere. And since we removed those Bengal tigers a while ago and moved them to their new habitats, I had a feeling that it would just work best doing this. So now we bring in our wonderful little red pandas. Our shelter is already made for them. It's very big for them, nonetheless. But we have a lot of issues that we have to figure out, and many of those include the temperature, along with their enrichment items, plants, and all that fun stuff. So we ended up throwing in some enrichment items. Nothing too big. We also have to make sure we bring in the feeders along with the water systems so they can drink water and also go ahead and eat bamboo. So that is one necessary step that we had to take into this. And another big part was actually adding in some climbing. And we don't have any animals that technically climb in this zoo. I mean, like the pandas and our Bengal tigers can climb to a certain extent, but it's not like they are like addicted to climbing. I don't know what the better word is, but I hope you understand what I mean by that. So I actually think it was pretty cool that we ended up adding the climbing toward the front of the park. It ended up working just fine, but as in for the temperature and stuff like that, I wanted to hide the coolers in certain areas so the guests wouldn't see them. And I tried to actually foolproof this plan this time, and I think I was mostly successful in that regard. And it's nothing like it's gonna deter our guests from looking into the habitat or anything, because it's not gonna change anything, but for realism's sake, we end up hiding them. So these red pandas, they spend a lot of their time in the temperate biome, along with like the taiga biome. Nonetheless, we have to make sure it's below 29 degrees Celsius, so we end up having to add in those coolers just about everywhere. So while I keep building our climbing structures here, I do want to just mention this one thing, and that is that we did not add much vegetation in, and I felt like there's one flaw about this, and that is because our barriers aren't that high. I don't want them to be super high either, but essentially our red pandas can't get out, which is the greatest thing about this habitat, but it's very narrow, and I feel like that's one of the downsides about this habitat. So as we look into how we do with our habitats and whatnot, I do want to point out the things that I think we didn't do as well in, and that is one of them. Now when we bring in our vegetation, we want to make sure we actually don't have our red pandas jumping out and climbing the trees to get out of the habitat and whatnot. That would be really bad for obvious reasons, right? So we end up putting in smaller trees, making sure the trees are more toward the middle, and we end up adding in a little bit. Now for this habitat, these guys like a lot of vegetation, and unfortunately we just don't give them a lot, but it does fulfill the requirements, which is the most important thing. I may look into actually adding in more vegetation, making it a little bit more green for them, as it would really spruce up the environment around them. And just a reminder, if at any point in time you guys do have any suggestions, please let me know. It's been a while since I've actually made a habitat in Planet Zoo, so I would really appreciate any help in that regard. But now we're adding in some of our landscaping tools. We're using the brush paint to put in some grass along with getting rid of all that dirt. I do use a lot of dirt, and you guys may wonder why. Just briefly, I'm going to mention why, and that is because it's very easy to figure out the land dynamics when you end up doing some terraforming. It's just easier to see where there's sharp inclines and where there's not, so that's why I do that. So moving on to phase 2. So the inner side of the habitat is done, and when I say done, I mean like it could use some more improvements, such as adding more vegetation like I mentioned earlier, but we need to make sure our guests can really use this area to their advantage and making sure that our guests can't see from the main pathway. This was very important considering that we don't want them to stop there. It's going to be a very busy path as it is. So we end up putting in a nice little stone wall. It wasn't anything too major, but it was going to look really weird if we just left it as it was, so we end up putting in some bamboo. We end up sinking into the ground a little bit, really trying to give it some of that green as well. Now this is another idea of where if your guests go into this area, they feel a little bit more like they're in the habitat itself, and that was kind of like the whole idea behind this. This is where we also add in our little informational signs and our little education, so our people can increase their education levels as they walk into our zoo and look at the animals, which is one of the objectives of this game. Obviously donation bins as well. I think the only thing that I missed out in this was adding in some educational speakers, as I'm just remembering that they actually exist, along with maybe even adding in some ambient speakers, because that would also be neat to put in. I'm going to look into that next time. Now the next biggest thing about this is that we actually have to include a fence, and the reason why is because we have that chain link fence, but then we have that little small gap of grass right in between the chain link fence and the pathway. So therefore we make a custom fence using basically a regular fence, but we end up adding a few other pieces to it, so it gives it a little bit more shape and a little bit more color, I didn't like the light wood finish, so we end up putting the little darker wood on there. We keep a little bit of the light wood, but we kind of do a little bit of give and take on it. We end up using the wood, we sink it down, so the little bar on the bottom of wood is really where the curb is. It's one of those small fences where people just can't get over it, so they won't touch the chain link fence. Not like they wouldn't do it in the game, but in real life this is something that we have to look out for. I think this actually ended up working out very well for this habitat, and it really gave it a nice little finish. And since it's very important to make sure that we stay consistent throughout the zoo, we also added in our wooden trimming, so we keep this area looking nice along all pathways. We really did ignore most of the front of the park for the most part. We really wanted to make sure we got back into fixing that area up a little bit, so we end up adding in the wooden trimming again, so it looks a little bit neater. We also have to make sure we add in some lighting as well, so therefore people can see, which is very important. We want to make sure this works at nighttime as well, and that's part of franchise mode, is making sure that nighttime works well. So therefore we end up adding in those lights. But other than that, I don't think there is anything else to go over. We are going to have some visuals at the end. But please make sure that you do subscribe so you can stay up to date on all things. Hit the thumbs up if you want to help support the channel. I would highly appreciate it. Any comments, suggestions, leave them down below, and I shall see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.